April 4th, 1862. President Lincoln sends General George McClellan with his Army of the Potomac to confront the Confederate capital in Richmond, Virginia. Lincoln hopes by taking the capital it will bring a swift end to the Confederates as well as an end to the war itself. McClellan's plan is to bring his troops down from the north and station them at Fort Monroe. From this position, he will begin his march up into Virginia. McClellan takes his 120,000 troops and starts to make his way up the peninsula. The first major battle to happen in this campaign was the Siege of Yorktown. The Union Army takes a heavy toll, but is eventually able to win the city by bringing out their heavy cannons. The Southern media was not incredibly concerned about the Union push up the peninsula. They only devoted a small paragraph on the side of the newspaper to inform the public what was happening. Some of the report read,
"Fight near Yorktown. General encouragement exported. Richmond, April 5th. Reports of fights near Yorktown have been current all day. The report is generally credited. The enemy attacked our lines at 10:30. Aside by their gunboats, the fighting continued until 12 o'clock, when the enemy ceased firing. Our troops maintained their position. An official dispatch received here at 10 o'clock this afternoon says there has been no general encouragement yet, but the armies are near each other and a battle is pending."
The newspaper would rather focus on the North, talking about Lincoln's emancipation scheme, but not the 120,000+ troops moving up toward their capital. After meeting Confederate forces on land, McClellan decides to send John Rodgers and 5 ships, including the USS Monitor, up the James River to bombard Richmond. On May 15th, he reaches Drew's Bluff and is met with fierce competition. The battle lasts for around 4 hours and ends in a stalemate, but the Confederates see this as an absolute win. The next day, the Southern newspapers are ecstatic, calling this an astounding victory for the Confederacy. One report stated,
"Richmond, May 15th. The following official dispatch was received by Drury Bluff, dated May 15th, 11 o'clock a.m. Sir, we have encouraged the enemy's 5 gunboats with 2.5 hours. We have fired the ironclad gunboat Galena. She was withdrawn and is going down the river accompanied by 3 wooden vessels. Our loss in killed and wounded is small. Respectfully, your audited servant, E. Farman. P.S. The Monitor has left."
John Letcher rallies Virginians later in the article, saying, "The capital of Virginia must not be surrendered. Virginians must rally to the rescue." The Confederates had to scuttle one of their favorite ships from the battle, the Merrimac, to make sure the Union didn't capture it. The newspaper pays homage to it in a large section stating how her roof, already covered with tallow and other fatty matter, was saturated with oil. Her crew were safely disembarked. Then they described the burning by saying the waters were brilliantly illuminated for miles, and how it was an awful but magnificent sight. June 25th, 1862. The Union forces have pushed up the peninsula and are extremely close to Richmond. The 7 days battle began between the two armies. Over a span of 7 days, 6 engagements between the two occur that will determine the fate of Richmond. The events of the battle are described in the Central Georgian newspaper. They indicate that they had some difficulty obtaining the information since the next 7 days were almost constant fighting. On June 26, the Southern newspapers give as much information as they can to the public. They write, "So far as the facts could be obtained, it appears certain that the 1st Louisiana Regiment were to engage for some time with 2 brigades of the enemy, who drove in our pickets about 8 o'clock a.m. Regardless of their heavy odds, the Confederates advanced upon the foe, shouting the battle cry of 'Butler! Butler!' The front of the enemy's lines fell back to confusion under the fierce onset, and the whole brigade would have been driven from the field but for a murderous crossfire from the enemy's ambuscade in the woods. They report that they lost around 2,000 troops, but are hopeful knowing that the loss of the enemy was very heavy. The next few days of battle are described briefly in the newspaper. In the first major victory, they estimated in the battle that 75,000 Confederate troops were engaged with an equal, if not superior, force of the enemy, when in reality, there were only 27,000 Federal troops. Later that day, when General McClellan pulls his troops back, they write, "The fight yesterday was a glorious victory for the Confederate Army." Robert E. Lee writes a letter to the president in the newspaper stating how he thanks God for granting their army a victory. He tells the president the success of their victory and how he grieves the loss of all his officers and men. The Confederates are able to hold their ground at Richmond and stop the Union advance. General McClellan decides to withdraw his troops all the way back to Harris's Landing. They describe these events in the newspaper by writing, "The bridges were destroyed by the enemy to prevent pursuit from the Confederates in the north. It is reported here that McClellan is retreating towards the James River, where his troops may embark in their transport under protection of their gunboats." The news of McClellan falling back is a huge morale booster for the Confederates. In the Weekly Constitutionalist, they write, "McClellan still retreating. Yesterday afternoon, McClellan destroyed a quantity of stores of every description and abandoned his fortifications preparatory to a retreat towards the James River, which was commenced last night through the White Oak Swamp. The Yankees have been closely followed by our troops and hundreds of prisoners taken. Stuart's cavalry captured 3,000 Yankees yesterday who were trying to escape to the York River. When McClellan arrives at Harris's Landing, Lincoln decides to come down and visit. He then later decides it is best for the army to withdraw from their position." This marks the end of the Peninsula Campaign. The Confederates consider this to be a huge victory because they were able to push back the Union and protect their capital. At the end of the campaign, the Union suffered 18,849 casualties, while the Confederates suffered over 20,000. George McClellan would later be removed from his position for not capturing Richmond, despite his troops outnumbering the Confederates' forces greatly. It was interesting to read how cocky and confident the South was when the North first landed on Fort Monroe. They only devoted a very small portion of the newspaper to it, not feeling the severity of the North so close to Richmond needed to be published. Then later, they realized how serious this was and started updating the public more and more on the North's movements. It also blew my mind that a battle would happen, and either the day of or the next day, a newspaper would publish the events of the battle. These are the events and battles that took place during the Peninsula Campaign and the newspaper articles that covered them, some of which did so in great detail and some of which did not.